Judge mocks teenager in court, shocked to learn he's a genius attorney in disguise. Rain hammered against the towering courthouse windows as 17-year-old Marco Sutton trudged through the grand marble foyer, shoulders weighed by more than just a battered backpack. The judge on the bench that day, Harriet Kingsley, famed for her razor-sharp tongue, was notorious for dismissing any defendant who wasn't a proper adult. Little did she know, Marco had secrets of his own. Not only had he aced bar-level exams in his spare time, but he'd also orchestrated a brilliant defense for someone close to him. All he needed was a chance to speak, and a chance to show that appearances can deceive. What happened next would shake the entire courtroom to its core. Marco Sutton woke up earlier than usual. The pale light of dawn crept through the shabby curtains of his family's small apartment in downtown Baltimore. At 17, he was used to the cramped setting, one bedroom he shared with his kid brother, a living area that doubled as a kitchen, and a constant hum of traffic just outside. His mother, Miriam, had already left for her morning shift at a local diner, leaving a brief note, "Good luck today." He didn't need the reminder. The date loomed in his mind like an iron weight. The first hearing for his older cousin, Tyrell, who'd been arrested for alleged burglary of a high-end store near the Inner Harbor. Marco believed wholeheartedly in Tyrell's innocence. He'd seen firsthand how Tyrell spent that night helping out at a charity drive. But the police had found suspicious evidence, and Tyrell's public defender was overstretched, barely responding to calls. Miriam, Tyrell's aunt, was frantic, and Marco had stepped in, determined to do something. Stretching his lanky frame, he donned well-worn sneakers and a black hoodie. Not exactly a lawyer's ensemble, but then again, he wasn't technically a lawyer, just a high school junior who secretly devoured every legal text he could get his hands on. A few months back, he discovered a local library had online access to advanced legal resources, including old court cases and bar exam prep questions. He'd studied them late into the night, enthralled by the logic and structure of the law. Still, all that knowledge might mean nothing if no one gave him a chance to speak in Tyrell's defense. Judge Harriet Kingsley was presiding. She was rumored to be a harsh disciplinarian who'd roast anyone unprepared. But for Marco, there was no turning back now. Grabbing a dog-eared notebook of carefully compiled evidence, he set off for the courthouse, bracing for a day that would test him in unimaginable ways. The imposing architecture of the Baltimore City courthouse made Marco's stomach flip. Columns soared against the dreary grey sky, and a throng of attorneys, clients, and security staff bustled around. Marco spotted the check-in area, a cluster of metal detectors and scanning machines. He clutched his backpack, heart pounding, as he inched forward in line. Around him, people wore suits and carried sleek briefcases, worlds apart from his worn jeans and hoodie. A security guard eyed him suspiciously, and Marco tensed. He had no illusions about how he looked, a tall, wiry teenager among the professional crowd, a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. He did his best to appear calm, stepping through the metal detector. It beeped once, making his heart jump, but the guard waved him on after a cursory check of the bag. Inside, the courthouse was a warren of hallways leading to different chambers. Polished marble floors, old wooden benches, and the scent of paperwork gave the place an austere feel. Somewhere in these halls was Judge Kingsley's courtroom. Tyrell's hearing was scheduled at 9:00 a.m. MTH, the public defender, had promised to do what she could, but from her brief phone conversation with Marco, he wasn't hopeful. She seemed overworked and dismissive, not entirely convinced Tyrell was telling the truth. Marco needed a plan. He'd compiled phone records, a timeline of Tyrell's whereabouts, even a statement from the charity organizer who swore Tyrell was with them that night. Yet the question loomed, would the judge let him speak? He took a seat on a wooden bench in the corridor outside courtroom 4B, rummaging through his battered notebook. Another wave of anxiety washed over him. Time was running short, and he could almost sense Harriet Kingsley's presence behind those closed doors. He drew a breath, resolved to see this through no matter the outcome. As Marco waited, anxious minutes ticking by, the hallway began to fill with more people. Lawyers in crisp suits glided past, chatting in hushed tones about their dockets. Defendants with nervous expressions paced, family members clinging to them in support. Meanwhile, a tall woman in an expensive pinstripe suit strutted by, flanked by an assistant carrying a stack of files. It was none other than the infamous Judge Harriet Kingsley. Even out of her robes, Harriet Kingsley exuded an intimidating aura. Mid-50s, her hair pinned in a severe bun, she had piercing grey eyes that seemingly flicked over every person in her vicinity with silent judgment. Marco had heard stories, how she once lambasted a lawyer for messing up a filing date, how she'd told a defendant that his excuses were as worthless as a used napkin. Rumor had it she'd grown up in a tough Philadelphia neighborhood, clawing her way through Yale Law School, a real name for reliability, and forging a reputation as a no-nonsense prosecutor before being appointed to the bench. Some hailed her as a champion of law and order. Others found her merciless, particularly with younger defendants. Marco overheard a nearby conversation. Remember when that 19-year-old tried to represent himself? Yeah, she tore him apart, calling him a child playing grown-up. Marco's heart fluttered. If Harriet saw him as just a teen, he feared she'd dismiss any attempt on his part to help Tyrell. He fiddled with his notebook, mind racing. I just need 5 minutes to show her the evidence. That was the hope. A bailiff emerged, calling out, "All rise for the Honourable Harriet Kingsley in courtroom 4B." People shuffled inside. The majestic wooden doors swung open. Marco swallowed, his limbs tingling with adrenaline. This was it. He was about to step into the lion's den, determined to prove Tyrell's innocence, and maybe show Harriet Kingsley that a teenage facade could hide a formidable intellect. Inside courtroom 4B, tall windows let in threads of muted daylight. Rows of wooden pews faced the raised bench where Harriet Kingsley now sat in her black robe, an air of authority radiating from her. She flipped through her docket, eyebrows pinched. Below her sat the clerks, busily typing away on computers. To the right, a single seat for the witness or defendant if called up. To the left, the public benches. Marco quietly slipped into a seat near the front, scanning for Tyrell. He spotted him off to the side, in a holding area. Tyrell's worried eyes lit up with relief at seeing Marco. The younger cousin offered a small wave. Marco tried to project confidence in return. Case after case was called, minor traffic violations, small claims. Harriet breezed through them, her stern manner sending each defendant scrambling to answer quickly. One older gentleman tried to explain why he missed a payment deadline, and Harriet cut him short. If you can't handle adult responsibilities, your excuses aren't worth hearing. She hammered her gavel, issuing a fine. Marco's stomach knotted. At last, the bailiff announced Tyrell's case, the State versus Tyrell Sutton. Tyrell was led to the defendant's table, his assigned public defender rummaging awkwardly through her folder. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with a perpetual frown, took his place on the opposite side. Harriet eyed them sharply. "Let's move along," Harriet said, her voice clipped. "Mr. Sutton is accused of burglary of the Rittenhouse jewelry store on June 5th. Are we prepared to proceed?" The public defender stammered something about needing more time. Harriet's impatience flared. "You had 2 weeks, counsel. If you're not prepared, this hearing will remain a formality." She flicked her gaze to Tyrell. And your client will be bound over for trial, or worse, incarcerated pending bail. Do you understand? Tyrell's face paled. Marco's chest tightened. This was the moment. If he didn't intervene somehow, Tyrell might be thrown in jail awaiting trial. Summoning a burst of courage, Marco clutched his notebook and rose to stand. He just had to find a way to be heard. Marco cleared his throat, voice trembling slightly. "Excuse me, Your Honor." A hush fell. Heads turned, noticing the teenager in the hoodie. Harriet lifted her gaze, lips pursed in disapproval. "Who are you?" she demanded, her tone chilly. Stepping forward, Marco tried to keep his composure. "I'm Marco Sutton, Tyrell's cousin. I have evidence that could exonerate him. If I might show." Harriet cut him off with a sharp laugh, the kind that echoed across the silent courtroom. A child addressing the court. "That's new. This is not a talent show, son." She glanced at the public defender. "Counsel, control your spectator." The public defender shot Marco an apologetic look. "Your Honor, Mr. Sutton is just a relative." "He's not," but Marco pressed on. "I've compiled phone records, location data, and testimonies, which I believe will prove." Tyrell wasn't near that jewelry store. He was at a charity event. "I can." Silence. Harriet barked, her eyes narrowing. "I won't have my courtroom turned into a circus. If you're not a licensed attorney or a recognized witness, sit down." A ripple of chuckles passed through the onlookers. The prosecutor smirked, leaning on his desk. Tyrell watched helplessly, wanting to say something but unable to risk the judge's ire. Shame washed over Marco, but his indignation flared too. Harriet's mocking tone stung like a slap. "She's not even letting me speak." But he steadied himself. "Your Honor, with respect, I've studied the law. My cousin's public defender might not have all the details. I beg you to let me present them." Harriet's gaze turned icy. "Studied the law? Let me guess. You took a high school civics class." Another round of sneering laughter from some corners of the room. Harriet pressed on. "Boy, I have no patience for amateurs playing lawyer. If you continue, I'll hold you in contempt." "Understood." Marco's fists clenched, but he lowered his head, stepping back. Harriet turned to the public defender. "As it stands, your client will be bound over for the next hearing with bail set at $50,000. The gavel slammed. Next case. Anger and despair churned in Marco's gut. He realized Harriet's prejudice ran deep, and the path to revealing the truth might be even steeper than he'd imagined. Outside the courtroom, Marco's frustration boiled. Tyrell was escorted back to a holding cell, the public defender trailing behind. Harriet's curt dismissal still rang in Marco's ears. All that carefully gathered evidence, shot down with a scoff just because he was young. He needed a new strategy. Slumping onto a wooden bench in the hallway, he fought the urge to storm away. That's when a soft voice caught his attention. "Kid, you were on to something in there." He looked up to find an older woman in a modest brown suit, her thick grey hair pinned back. She extended a hand. "I'm Caroline Nichols. Used to practice law here before retirement. I come by sometimes to observe." "Harriet Kingsley, well, let's say I'm not her biggest fan." Marco shook Caroline's hand, confusion swirling. Yeah, thanks, but she wouldn't even hear me out." Caroline nodded sympathetically. "Harriet's always been rough on novices, and especially on anyone she deems beneath her. She's a brilliant judge in some respects, but that arrogance blinds her to real injustice." Her gaze sharpened. "You said you have evidence that your cousin was elsewhere when the burglary happened." Marco gave a weary nod, handing her his battered notebook. She flipped through it, eyebrows lifting at the neat columns of references, phone logs, and timestamps. "This is quite thorough. Where'd you learn all this?" He flushed, shrugging. "Online courses, library resources, bar exam prep. I'm no actual lawyer, but I studied the relevant sections of the law. Caroline's lips quirked into a small smile. You know more than some attorneys I've met. Harriet, though, won't respect you unless you can approach her on equal footing. She paused. There's a motion hearing tomorrow in the same courtroom for Tyrell's bail. If you can get recognized as counsel of record, Harriet's hands might be tied. Marco blinked in surprise. But I'm not licensed. I'm 17. Caroline's eyes sparkled with mischief. There might be a loophole if you can find a sponsor attorney or an emergency provision, especially if your cousin waives standard representation. Harriet can't ignore that. Let me think how we can make it happen, because you, young man, might be Tyrell's best shot. Back at the Sutton apartment that evening, Marco pored over legal guidelines with Caroline Nichols on a video call. Latoya, Tyrell's mother, had rushed in from her shift, anxious for updates. She hovered nearby, equal parts curious and wary about this crazy idea of letting a 17-year-old speak as a lawyer. Maryland has something called a law student practice rule for certain supervised cases, Caroline explained. But you're underage, not in law school. This is uncharted territory. However, there's a possibility the judge could grant a special hearing if you demonstrate competence and if Tyrell specifically requests you as counsel. Latoya frowned, but Harriet Kingsley hates that sort of exception. She'll just laugh him out again. Marco shifted in his seat. Maybe, but if I manage to produce actual legal documents and cite the rules properly, Harriet might be forced to let me speak. Or at least I can be the mouthpiece through an attorney sponsor, someone who can stand with me, letting me do the main argument. Caroline nodded. Yes, and if we do that, it might shame Harriet into hearing you out. She's tough, but she can't violate procedure in open court, especially if the press is around. Marco's thoughts churned. This was an enormous gamble. Harriet's hostility was almost guaranteed. But he had an advantage, meticulous research, and a willingness to push boundaries. We'll get a sponsor attorney, Caroline declared. I'll ask an old colleague at the Bar Association for a favor. Meanwhile, you finalize your argument. Remember, Harriet won't be swayed by emotional pleas. Cite precedents. Use bulletproof logic. Latoya, arms folded, exhaled shakily. I just want my son out of jail. If you think this is our best chance, I'll stand behind you. She turned to Marco, eyes full of a mother's faith. You do what you have to do, baby. God knows we have no one else. That night, as darkness cloaked the city, Marco typed away on a borrowed laptop, refining his motions and arguments. Every pang of doubt was overshadowed by a simple truth. Tyrell's future depends on me. No matter how Harriet mocked him, he'd be prepared for war. Morning dawned bright and crisp. Caroline's friend, an attorney named Marcus Lewinsky, agreed to meet Marco at the courthouse. Marco wore his neatest collared shirt, still looking more like a high school student than a lawyer, carrying a stack of typed documents in a folder labeled Sutton v. Estate. As he hopped off the bus in front of the imposing courthouse, he spotted Lewinsky, a short, balding man in a rumpled suit, waiting on the steps. You must be Marco, Lewinsky said, mustache twitching with a cautious smile. Caroline told me about your unique situation. I don't fully understand it, but I'm here to stand as your sponsor attorney if the judge allows it. That means I remain responsible, but you get to do the main arguments, right? Marco nodded eagerly. Yes, sir. We have to follow the local rules. It's an unusual request, but Tyrell specifically wants me to represent him. Our best bet is to argue that I've done all the research. I have a direct stake, and this is a special circumstance. Harriet might refuse, but if we cite the law properly, she can't just ignore me. Lewinsky sighed. All right, let's not get our hopes too high. Harriet is quite the personality. They entered the lobby, tension thrumming in Marco's veins. Observers in suits gave him skeptical looks, Like, is that kid lost? But he steadied himself, following Lewinsky to courtroom 4B. Inside, Harriet was already presiding over small matters. Eventually, Tyrrell's name was called again for the motion regarding bail. Tyrrell, in a prison jumpsuit, was led to the stand. The public defender gave a half-hearted wave at the defense side. Harriet started, counsel. Are you ready? Lewinsky stood, clearing his throat. Your Honor, I request permission for a special arrangement. My associate here, Marco Sutton, wishes to speak on behalf of the defendant. Under Local Rule 6.2, we can ask for a discretionary allowance if the client so requests, and if it's in the interest of justice. Gasps rippled across the courtroom. Marco felt Harriet's piercing stare. The tension soared. This is it, he thought, knuckles whitening on his folder. One look at Harriet's expression told him she was far from amused. Harriet stared at Lewinsky as if he'd just proposed reciting Shakespeare mid-trial. Then her gaze snapped to Marco, who stood by Lewinsky's side. The hush in the courtroom was palpable. Let me get this straight, Harriet said, ice in her tone. We have a child, and I emphasize child, who wants to speak in official capacity for the defendant. This is beyond unconventional. It's absurd. Lewinsky cleared his throat. Your Honor, the local rules discretionary clause allows a judge to permit limited representation by an individual who can demonstrate special competence, provided a licensed attorney is present to oversee. Harriet cut him off with a curt wave. I know the rule, Counselor, but in all my years, I've never seen it applied to a high school kid. She fixed Marco with a chilly glare. I suppose you fancy yourself a young Johnny Cochran. Or perhaps you binge-watched legal dramas. A ripple of snickering came from the prosecution's side. Tyrrell winced behind the defense table. Marco's cheeks reddened, but he forced composure, meeting Harriet's gaze. Your Honor, I've compiled evidence and witness statements that my cousin's appointed counsel never presented. If I'm allowed to do so, I can prove Tyrrell's innocence, or at minimum show why bail should be lowered or waived. Harriet's lip curled. This is a mockery. I ought to hold you in contempt for wasting the court's time. She turned back to Lewinsky. Counsel, do you truly stand by this request? Or is this some media stunt? Lewinsky responded softly. I stand by it, Your Honor. Mr. Sutton has extensively prepared. The defendant specifically requested him. We ask for your indulgence in the interest of justice. For several tense seconds, Harriet tapped her pen. Then she sighed in exasperation. Fine. Let's see this so-called brilliance. If you embarrass yourself, don't cry. Proceed briefly. She glared at the prosecutor. This is a motion hearing, not a trial. Keep it short. Marco swallowed, stepping forward. A sense of both terror and elation flooded him. Harriet had opened the door. Now it was time to prove he deserved to walk through it. Marco cleared his throat, stepping to the podium with all eyes upon him. He was acutely aware of how young he must look. Harriet's stare felt like a laser on his back. He opened his folder, drew a breath, and began. Your Honor, we're here regarding Tyrrell Sutton's bail, currently set at $50,000, which, frankly, is excessive for someone with no prior convictions and strong community ties. I request either a significant reduction or personal recognizance, because Tyrrell poses no flight risk. Moreover, I have proof that he likely didn't commit the offense, which should weigh in favor of less restrictive bail. He paused, scanning the room. The prosecutor folded his arms, unimpressed. Harriet remained stone-faced. Focus, Marco reminded himself. He continued, first, the night of the alleged burglary, Tyrrell was volunteering at a youth center. I have time-stamped photos plus affidavits from the center's staff. Second, phone geolocation data shows. Tyrrell's phone was across town from the store's location at the relevant time. I submitted copies of these logs. Marco flicked to page 2 in his notes, his voice steadying. The prosecution's evidence is circumstantial. A single, grainy security cam shot of someone wearing a similar jacket. No fingerprints, no eyewitness ID. The store's manager admitted the suspect's face was partially covered. Therefore, the case for strong suspicion is weak. Under Maryland law, bail should reflect the likelihood of guilt and the defendant's ties to the community. Tyrrell's got a stable home, a job, and no flight risk. Hence, $50,000 is punitive. He glanced up, noticing Harriet's expression shift slightly. She wasn't laughing now. In conclusion, Marco said, "We ask the court to reduce bail or grant an or release. Tyrrell can't afford a $50,000 bond. The presumption of innocence is paramount, especially when the evidence is so thin." Silence followed. Harriet steepled her fingers, studying him as if seeing him for the first time. The prosecutor coughed, rifling through his own notes. Lewinsky gave a small nod of encouragement. Marco released a quiet breath, unsure if he'd managed to impress Harriet or if she was just reloading for another scathing rebuke. After a moment's pause, Harriet turned to the prosecutor, Mr. Billings. "Prosecutor, do you wish to respond to Mr. Sutton's?" She seemed to struggle with the word counsel, arguments. Billings stood, a practiced smirk on his face. He was short, sporting a tidy mustache, and exuded a self-assured demeanor. "Yes, Your Honor. While I appreciate the young man's enthusiasm, he overlooks key aspects. The store's security camera, while grainy, captures a distinctive jacket that Tyrrell Sutton was known to wear. Also, the volunteer center's sign-in sheet might be forged or manipulated. We can't trust that without cross-examination." Marco felt a flash of annoyance. Manipulated? Seriously? Billings continued. "Additionally, phone location data is not always foolproof. There can be errors." Coupled with the store manager's statement that the suspect's build matched Tyrrell's, it's enough to keep him under suspicion. He turned a smug eye on Marco. In short, the state believes the bail set is appropriate, given the seriousness of burglary. If the defendant truly wants to prove innocence, that's for trial. For now, we see no reason to reduce bail. The prosecutor sat, clearly pleased with himself. Harriet let his words hang in the air, then focused on Marco again. "Well, Mr. Sutton, do you have a rebuttal?" Marco's heart hammered. He nodded, stepping forward. "Phone data can have margins of error, yes, but not entire miles. And we have multiple staffers at the youth center who signed sworn affidavits. They're reputable individuals. The sign-in sheet is corroborated by people's personal testimonies. Also, the manager's statement about suspect's build is hardly conclusive. Tyrrell is 6 feet tall, which is not unusual. Many share that stature. He inhaled. What's more, the distinctive jacket is found in wide circulation. Dozens own that brand. The lack of direct, verifiable evidence means it's unfair to impose such a high bail, punishing the defendant with no prior record. This stands contrary to the principle of ensuring that bail is not used punitively. A faint flicker of interest crossed Harriet's face. She glanced at the case file in front of her, lips pursed. Am I actually getting through to her? Marco wondered, adrenaline surging. The tension soared, and the question remained, would Harriet remain dismissive or acknowledge that this teen might actually have a point? Harriet leaned back in her seat, tapping a pen against the desk. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her ruling. She shifted her gaze from Tyrrell, who looked hopeful, to the prosecutor, who glowered, then to Marco, who stood with his notebook clasped in white-knuckled grip. I find both sides have raised some valid points, Harriet said slowly, her tone measured. But this is a bail hearing, not a trial. The threshold of evidence for bail decisions is less strict than for a conviction. However, the defense has provided enough to suggest that the existing bail might be excessive under these circumstances. She paused, scanning the room. Therefore, the first will reduce the bail to $10,000. A wave of relief rippled through Tyrell's expression. Harriet glared at him. This does not mean you're off the hook, Mr. Sutton. You still face burglary charges. But your cousin's argument has at least shown reasonable doubt to justify a lower bail. The gavel slammed once. This hearing is concluded. A hush followed. Then murmurs broke out across the gallery. Tyrell's public defender, who had remained mostly silent, looked both surprised and somewhat embarrassed that a teen had done all the heavy lifting. The prosecutor frowned, scribbling notes. Marco felt an exhilarating sense of achievement. We did it, sort of. They hadn't dismissed the charges, but Tyrell could potentially afford the new bail with help from friends and family. Harriet, though not exactly praising him, had at least recognized his argument. As the bailiff called the next case, Harriet's parting glance at Marco held a strange mix of grudging respect and lingering disdain. She's not done with me yet, he sensed. Indeed, there was a trial date ahead, one where the stakes would be far higher. For the moment, though, Marco savored a small victory in a system that typically chewed up those who lacked power or status. They had a foothold. Next step, prove Tyrell's innocence once and for all. In the courthouse hallway, Tyrell was escorted past, a guard at his side, but with a small smile of gratitude directed at Marco. They'd finalize paperwork, and hopefully Tyrell could be released on the reduced bail within a day or two. Meanwhile, the last swirl of adrenaline faded from Marco's veins, replaced by a wave of exhaustion. Lewinsky clapped Marco on the back, half laughing. "Kid, I got to admit, you impressed me. I've seen brand new attorneys buckle under Harriet's glare. You held your ground and delivered a coherent argument. That's no small feat." Marco smiled bashfully. "Thanks. Couldn't have done it without you standing as sponsor." He turned to see Caroline Nichols approaching from the side, her eyes shining. She must have slipped in during the hearing. She gave him a thumbs up. "You did well. Harriet respects competence, even if she won't admit it." Latoya waited near a bench, wringing her hands. The moment Marco approached, she pulled him into a fierce hug. "I can't believe you pulled that off," she whispered, tears brimming. "Thank you, baby. Tyrell might be out soon." Marco's face warmed. He'll still face trial, but at least he won't rot in jail. We have time to gather more evidence. Then a sobering thought struck him. But Harriet won't show mercy next time. If we want to avoid a conviction, we need ironclad proof. The state might bring more so-called evidence. "We have to stay sharp," Caroline nodded. "Indeed, Harriet gave you an opening, but the actual trial is a whole different beast. The prosecutor might dig deeper, try to discredit your volunteer center alibi. We need to confirm everything." She patted Marco's shoulder. "I'll help coordinate the investigative side. Marcus Lewinsky can remain your sponsor attorney, so you can keep presenting. You up for that?" Marco inhaled, gazing at the courthouse pillars. A full trial, he thought, with me, a 17-year-old, leading the defense arguments. Fear and excitement mingled in his chest, but Tyrell's fate was on the line, and Marco had already taken the first step. There was no turning back. Over the following days, Tyrell managed to post the reduced bail, returning home with a mixture of relief and tension. He couldn't travel freely or miss check-ins, but at least he wasn't behind bars. Meanwhile, Marco launched into full detective mode. With Caroline's guidance, he began gathering every possible shred of exonerating proof. He visited the Volunteer Youth Center, speaking to the staff who worked the night of the alleged burglary. Some recalled Tyrell helping stock food banks, while others saw him delivering donated clothes. More. Promisingly, the center had a camera monitoring the entrance. The director, a kindly older man named James Porter, revealed that it might have recorded Tyrell entering or exiting around the critical hours. The footage was stored on an old hard drive. If they could retrieve timestamps showing Tyrell's presence, it would be a slam dunk. However, the device was glitchy, and the center lacked funds to repair it. Marco also checked with local shops near the volunteer center for possible security cameras. One store, a 24-hour diner, captured a figure that might be Tyrell passing by, though the angle was distant. Still, every bit helped. He compiled statements, cross-checking times. The more he found, the more certain he became of Tyrell's innocence. Yet, a lingering worry nagged at him. The Rittenhouse jewelry store's manager claimed to have recognized Tyrell, though not clearly. Could someone have framed him, or was it a misunderstanding? Marco suspected the real burglar might have worn a jacket resembling Tyrell's, leading the manager to jump to conclusions. The police latched onto that, ignoring contradictory evidence. As the trial date approached, Caroline arranged a formal meeting with Marcus Lewinsky, Marco and Tyrell to finalize strategy. They needed to ensure Harriet would have no wiggle room to dismiss them, because once the trial commenced, Harriet's mocking attitude would be overshadowed by the demands of the law, a law that Marco was determined to master in time. The day of the trial arrived under a heavy, slate-grey sky. Marco carried his trademark folder, now bursting with affidavits, location prints, and new volunteer center footage. The center's battered hard drive had been salvaged enough to extract partial video. Tyrell walked beside him, wearing borrowed dress pants, a worried expression etched on his face. Meanwhile, Caroline and Lewinsky joined them, serving as a support team. The plan was that Marco would handle the bulk of the defense's presentation, with Lewinsky stepping in only if Harriet or the prosecution tried to shut him down. Courtroom 4B teamed with spectators' friends, curious onlookers, and a few local reporters who'd caught wind of a teen lawyer scenario. Harriet, seated on the bench, maintained her usual sternness, eyes flicking over the crowd. The clerk called the case, the State versus Tyrell Sutton. Tyrell took his place at the defense table, flanked by Marco and Lewinsky. The prosecutor, Billings, stood at the opposite side, a neat stack of papers in front of him. Harriet rapped her gavel. Let's proceed with opening statements. The prosecution first. Billings launched into a summary, how the store was burgled, certain items stolen, a partial match of the suspect's clothing, the manager's statement, and so on. He heavily implied that Tyrell had a shaky alibi, referencing uncorroborated volunteer center sign-in sheets. Billings closed by stating the state would prove Tyrell's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Harriet turned to the defense table, eyes narrowing slightly at Marco. Defense, are you ready with your opening? Marco stood, feeling the weight of the entire courtroom's gaze. This was no mere bail hearing, this was the real trial, with a jury in place, a prosecutor determined to convict, and Harriet's scornful presence overshadowing every word. Nevertheless, he squared his shoulders, took a breath, and prepared to speak his most significant test yet. Marco cleared his throat. Good morning, Your Honor, members of the jury and counsel. My name is Marco Sutton, speaking under the supervision of Mr. Lewinsky on behalf of Tyrell Sutton. Let me be clear, the defense will show that the prosecution's evidence is flimsy and overshadowed by solid proof. Tyrell was elsewhere that night. He paused, scanning the jurors, everyday people, some with curious eyes, others skeptical. Harriet tapped a pen, impatience in her posture, but she remained silent. In the coming testimony, Marco continued, you'll hear from volunteer center staff who saw Tyrell. You'll see phone records indicating he never left that part of the city. And crucially, we have partial video footage from the youth center's security camera. It may not be perfect, but it further aligns with Tyrrell's presence there, not at Rittenhouse Jewelry Store. He allowed a beat. The state claims the store manager identified Tyrrell, but we suspect mistaken identity. The manager only saw a figure with a hooded jacket and believed it resembled Tyrrell's, yet no direct facial recognition, no fingerprints tying Tyrrell to the scene. We question why the police latched onto him so quickly, ignoring stronger exonerating leads. Marco's voice steadied, confidence glowing. By the end, you'll realize Tyrell Sutton is simply a victim of circumstance and assumption. We ask you to keep an open mind, watch the evidence carefully, and see that the real story points to a fundamental truth. Tyrell didn't do this. He closed his folder, heartbeat thudding. The jury seemed attentive. Billings sat with pursed lips. Harriet gave a curt nod. Very well, proceed with the prosecution's first witness. Marco exhaled, meeting Tyrrell's anxious gaze. The train was rolling now, there was no stopping it. As the state called their first witness, Harriet's demeanor still spelled doubt, but at least she'd given him space to speak. Next up, cross-examination and the real test of his legal wit. The state's first witness was Officer Green, no relation to Marco's family, one of the policemen who responded to the burglary call. He described finding the glass door smashed, items missing, and a tip from the store manager suggesting the culprit looked like Tyrrell. The officer recounted searching Tyrrell's social media, noticing a photo of Tyrrell wearing a similar jacket. That formed the basis of probable cause for the arrest. Marco took notes, eyes sharp. When Billings finished, Harriet nodded at the defense. Cross-examination, Marco stood, adjusting his notes. Officer Green, you stated the store manager, said the suspect looked like Tyrrell. Did the manager explicitly say it was Tyrrell by name? The officer hesitated. Not exactly. He said the suspect's build was like Tyrrell's. He recognized him from around the neighborhood. Marco pressed on. So, no direct ID, just a general comment. Did the manager mention any distinctive feature, like a tattoo, face shape, or voice? The officer shuffled. No, just the jacket and the build. Marco nodded. And the police never recovered stolen items from Tyrrell or his residence, correct? No, we didn't find anything, the officer admitted, clearly uncomfortable. Thank you, officer, Marco said. No further questions. Next, the store manager took the stand. He insisted it had to be Tyrrell, but under Marco's gentle but persistent questioning, he admitted seeing the burglar only in a brief glimpse. From behind. He wore a hood, was tall. Yeah, but I didn't see his face fully, the manager confessed. So you based your assumption on the silhouette and clothing? Marco asked. Yes, that's right, the manager said, a bit defensive. Marco concluded, no further questions, Your Honor. The store manager's testimony fell short of definitive. Harriet looked bored but made no scathing remarks. The prosecution had little else besides that. Billings ended by reiterating the suspicion that Tyrrell's alibi might be fake. Harriet signaled the state to rest their case. Now it was Marco's turn to bring forth a wave of defense evidence. Time to show Harriet and the jury the truth, he thought, adrenaline surging. Marco called his first witness James Porter, the volunteer center director, a gentle-faced man in a sweater vest. Porter detailed how Tyrrell arrived around 6 p.m. That evening, helped set up tables, distributed supplies, and left well after 10 p.m. The burglary occurred around 9:30 p.m., half a city away. Billings tried to discredit Porter, suggesting the sign-in sheet could be manipulated, but Porter insisted the process was routine, with volunteers signing in and out for liability reasons. Tyrrell's signature is right here, time stamped, and plenty of folks saw him, Porter said calmly. Next, Marco produced the partial security footage. On the screen was a timestamp reading 9:15 p.m. to 9:45 p.m. The angle was mostly of the hallway. but one could see a tall figure matching Tyrell's description walking back and forth carrying boxes, wearing the same outfit from that evening, minus the jacket. Billings objected, claiming the video might be time-stamped incorrectly. However, Caroline Nichols had an affidavit from a technician stating the timestamp matched the actual clock. Harriet studied the footage with a frown but didn't interject. Finally, cell phone location logs. Marco displayed them, pointing to the distance from the store at 9:30 p.m. Even with margin of error, Tyrell's phone was nowhere near Rittenhouse jewelry at the critical time, Marco concluded. The jury seemed engaged. A few members nodded. Harriet tapped her pen, her expression revealing a flicker of grudging respect. Billings tried to poke holes, but each time Marco calmly responded with data, references, or an affidavit. In the end, Billings had little to stand on, besides the manager's half-remembered silhouette. Marco closed the defense's presentation with a quiet sense of confidence. Now, all that remained was final arguments and Harriet's instructions to the jury. If logic prevailed, Tyrell would be free. But Harriet was unpredictable. They needed to see if the judge would level the field or tip it. Harriet gave each side a chance for closing arguments. Billings addressed the jury first, rehashing the store manager's recognition of Tyrell, albeit flawed. He insinuated the volunteer center's sign in might be orchestrated by well-meaning but biased acquaintances. "We can't be sure the video timestamps are accurate," he repeated, grasping at straws. Then Marco stepped up, folder in hand, a bead of sweat tracing down his temple. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the state's entire case rests on vague recollection and a jacket." In contrast, the defense provided multiple lines of evidence, placing Tyrell at the volunteer center. "We have phone logs, video, multiple witnesses, all align with the same timeline. The store manager never saw Tyrell's face. No stolen items were found on him, and the supposed jacket is a common brand. I ask, is that enough to convict beyond a reasonable doubt?" He paused, scanning the jurors' faces. "If there's even a shred of doubt that Tyrell was at the scene, the law obligates you to find him not guilty. Here, we don't just have a shred, we have a solid contradiction. My cousin is a young man who devotes his free time to community service. He's never stolen anything. The prosecution's narrative is built on assumption, not proof. In the name of justice, I urge you to return a verdict of not guilty." Marco stepped back, adrenaline pounding. Harriet nodded curtly, turning to the jury. "You've heard the arguments. I will give you instructions on the law. Then you'll deliberate. Court is recessed until we reconvene for the verdict." As the bailiff escorted the jury out, Harriet's gaze flicked to Marco. Something akin to an approving glint sparked in her eyes, though overshadowed by her usual sternness. "Maybe she sees I'm serious now," he mused, but the real test would be the jury's decision and Harriet's final stance if any post-verdict motions arose. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity. Tyrell waited, hands clasped, sweat forming on his brow. Caroline tried to reassure him, while Lewinsky whispered an occasional "stay calm." Marco paced in the hallway, mind swirling with second-guessing. Did I handle the cross-examination well enough? Did I refute Billings' claims thoroughly? At last, a clerk signaled them back into the courtroom. Harriet sat on her bench, impassive. The jurors filed in, their expressions guarded. The judge asked, "Madam Foreperson, have you reached a unanimous verdict?" The foreperson, a middle-aged woman, stood. "We have, Your Honor." She handed a slip of paper to the bailiff, who passed it to Harriet. The judge read it, face unreadable, then returned it. "On the charge of burglary in the first degree, how do you find the defendant, Tyrell Sutton?" The foreperson cleared her throat. "Not guilty." A collective exhale spread through Tyrell, Marco, and their supporters. A wave of relief was so palpable that Tyrell almost wept. Harriet hammered her gavel lightly, nodding. "The jury has spoken, Aunt Emista. Sutton is hereby acquitted of all charges. He may leave free of all restrictions." She eyed Billings with a cool expression. "Prosecution, your case was not sufficiently grounded. Court is adjourned." The gallery buzzed. Tyrell embraced Marco, tears brimming. "Thank you, man. You saved me." Marco's own eyes glistened. In that moment, all the nights of studying, the scorn from Harriet, the risky decision to stand as quasi-counsel, they all felt vindicated. Harriet rose from the bench, gathering her note. Before she left, she paused near Marco, her voice subdued. "Mr. Sutton, while this proceeding was highly unorthodox, you handled yourself with surprising skill. Let's hope you use that intellect responsibly if you continue in the legal field." Then, with a swish of her robes, she disappeared behind the door. Marco let out a shaky laugh. Harriet's words, though grudging, felt like the highest compliment. "I guess I showed her," he thought, a triumphant grin spreading. Days later, the courthouse rumor mill buzzed about Harriet's unexpected concession to a teenage advocate. Some praised her for letting justice prevail despite her initial skepticism. Others murmured that Harriet had been humbled. Meanwhile, Billings faced snickers in the legal community for losing to a high schooler, tarnishing his proud record. Yet Harriet's mocking in the early phase had left scars on Tyrell, who nearly languished in jail if not for Marco's persistence, and on Marco himself, who realized how easily prejudice could block even the most determined person from being heard. The contrast was stark. Harriet, once so dismissive, had grudgingly recognized Marco's competence in the end. For Harriet, the experience left a subtle imprint. During subsequent cases, eyewitnesses noted she reined in her harsh tone with younger defendants, sometimes even giving them a chance to speak or clarifying procedures more patiently. Perhaps she recalled that behind a youthful face might lie remarkable intelligence, and that the law, after all, was about fairness, not intimidation. Meanwhile, Marco's story spread around local circles, the teen who bested a tough judge. A reporter from the Baltimore Sun approached him for an interview. He politely declined, not wanting fame, but the anecdote circulated enough to land him offers of mentorship from some local lawyers. Though he was still underage, law schools from the region whispered about scholarships if he pursued a JD in the future. At home, Tyrell resumed volunteering and found a new job. Freed from the false charges, he credited Marco's unwavering faith as the difference maker. Their bond, once just cousinly, deepened into mutual respect. Late one afternoon, Marco visited Caroline Nichols for tea. They sipped from steaming mugs, discussing how Harriet's scorn turned to reluctant acceptance, how Billings crumbled, and how the system, flawed as it was, could be nudged toward justice by even the most unexpected voices. Caroline patted Marco's shoulder. "Remember, you might be 17, but the power of knowledge has no age limit." And as Marco gazed at the city skyline, brimming with possibility, he knew this was only the beginning of his journey in law, proof that brilliance could thrive, no matter what obstacles sneered in its path. In a courtroom where one judge's scoffing laughter set the stage for a bruising showdown, the unlikeliest hero emerged, a 17-year-old who refused to be silenced or sidelined. Marco Sutton's unwavering belief in justice, fueled by late-night study sessions and raw determination, ultimately dismantled a shaky case and set his cousin free. By facing down Judge Harriet Kingsley's initial ridicule, he proved that true talent knows no age, and that the scales of justice can tilt when courage meets preparation. If this story uplifted you, showing how grit and knowledge can topple prejudice, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Every interaction helps us bring more powerful tales of resilience and justice to life. Stay tuned for more dramatic stories that showcase the power of ordinary individuals stepping up to defend what's right and winning against the odds.